This episode of Job Shadowing HE is kindly sponsored by GuildHE Sanderson, the UK's leadership expert across public services, not-for-profit and education. Partnering with universities to navigate change and build stronger, more inclusive leadership teams, GuildHE Sanderson has deep expertise in executive search, interim leadership and leadership development. Through executive search and interim leadership services, they identify and place HE leaders who reflect the communities they serve and who can drive success as the higher education landscape evolves. Through leadership development and talent consultancy services, they work closely with you to develop leaders who can deliver lasting impacts in inclusivity, collaboration and performance. Whether you're looking for your next Vice-Chancellor or seeking to recruit and develop your senior leaders, choose the experts who are known for delivering diverse shortlists, long-lasting leadership interventions and world-class client and candidate service. I am Susanna Marsden, a higher education consultant who helps to develop and support HE institutions in the UK and beyond. This podcast takes a deep dive into the roles of people who work in this hugely varied higher education sector. Each episode reveals what's involved in a specific role, the career path that led to it, and tips on how to get in and get on in these jobs. My guest in this episode is Brooke Storer-Church, Chief Executive Officer of GuildHE, which represents around 70 diverse institutions in the higher education sector. In this episode, Brooke reflects upon why diversity is so important to UK higher education and talks about the way in which GuildHE is working to support and champion this part of our HE sector. She also discusses her career pathway into and through higher education, as well as what's been her focus along with that of her team since she became CEO in June 2024. Brooke, welcome to the podcast and thanks for being my guest on this episode. You became the new Chief Executive of GuildHE in June 2024, and GuildHE is a sector representative body for quite a diverse range of higher education institutions. Can you say a bit more about the focus and purpose of the organisation?
Yeah. Hi, Susanna. I'd love to. GuildHE, I think a lot of people are familiar with the name. We've been around for quite a long time. And originally was a standing council, I think it was, or committee of principals for teacher education providers who were not part of the Developing Universities UK membership. And it has since evolved to really represent smaller scale institutions, smaller scale universities, specialist institutions, and what I call non-traditional institutions. So some of those are online providers like the University College of Estate Management. Some of them are business models that are, for-profit providers, but which actually funnel a lot of the money back into the educational offer. So they're really just a huge bag of mixes in terms of provider types. But yeah, we are actively working to build that community. It's quite an exciting time.
One of the aims of Job Shadowing HE is to shed light on the diverse range of people and institutions or organisations that make up the sector, because I think it's all too easy just to see the sector as the big universities. So I'm interested to know how often GuildHE is in the position of needing to remind people about that reality of our diverse sector. and what are your thoughts? I'm sure you've got some about the extent to which the sector terminology might need to become a bit more inclusive.
Every day, in answer to your question, do we need to remind people? And I was thinking while you were asking that question, you're a woman after my own heart with the observation that the sector is often too, the shorthand of universities is something that I never thought was terribly problematic before I joined GuildHE in 2012. And as I became the higher education lead for colleges, I learned, well, that's not terribly inclusive. So universities and colleges became my moniker. And, certainly now as the lead of GuildHE, I think, oh gosh, it really is better just to say institutions, even if people might not appreciate that. And it's a really ripe time to have these types of conversations. I think, my own journey into my existing job wasn't exactly what you would expect. Therefore, I bring a certain rather colorful perspective to my own role. I really value bringing in people into my team that come from a kind of wide variety of backgrounds for that sort of perspectival variety. And the sector is no different, really. So and it's ironic that as a sector, one of the values we have spent long hours, weeks, and months and years now promoting has been around equality, diversity, and inclusion. And yet we are quick to think of the sector as just one type of thing, which is really often the kind of large scale multi-faculty university that is, drummed up in our minds, certainly is what we think of the government considers the image of the sector. But actually, it's so much more diverse than that. And we see when we look further afield, Australia is a good example of what can happen when that diversity of institutional type isn't actively preserved. It actually weakens the higher education system. The massification we've all been experiencing in higher education globally ends up reducing the offer to something quite generalist and generic that only works for a smaller number of students. So you actually undermine your interest in driving towards equality of opportunity. As well as I would suggest, undermine the government's own ambitions around regional growth and other things. And of course, you'd expect me to be rehearsing arguments, but how what we do and what we care about relates to what the government wants. That's the exercise we're all in now.
Looking a bit about your career, I mean, you started as a research associate and then went on to being a graduate teaching assistant at the University of Bristol. And as you just mentioned, you then moved to what was then the Higher Education Funding Council for England, or HEFCE, as a policy advisor. Now, you've given us a little hint about a colourful background there. What led up to you working in the HE sector, and what was it about HE that attracted you?
I like to talk about this, I suppose, because I do think that we tend to think people have quite well planned out career trajectories. I got here because I decided somehow when I was 18 that this was going to be the job, and it couldn't be further from the truth. I went to Penn State University in the US, and I studied journalism with double minors in English and women's studies. That was because I liked those things, not because I intended to be a journalist. In fact, during the course of the degree, I decided I definitely wasn't going to be a journalist, and this will be a theme that you hear from me in a number of instances. So then I just decided I needed more adventure in my life. So I moved out to California, and I ended up spending a decade trying to open my own restaurant. So I was working in originally like bars and grills, all the way up to fine dining restaurants. I worked in wineries. I founded a pop-up restaurant before they were something cool that anybody knew what they were. I spent some time living in Colorado and then up in Portland, Oregon for a long time. And it was really only in my late 20s, just as I was about to turn 30. And I'd spent that 10 years, and all of my peers were deeply immersed in the restaurant industry. In fact, I didn't know anybody beyond it. And I was like, ooh, I see what life looks like in my 30s. It's right ahead of me. I can just look around at all my peers. Very few can keep a plant alive, much less have a pet or kids. We're all working 16-hour days for very thin profit margins in a passion, an absolute labor of love. But my God, it started to feel quite frivolous. It didn't feel quite as meaningful. And so I ended up leaving the States. So that was in 2005. I spent a year and a half in Asia, Thailand and South Korea teaching English, trying to figure out what it was I was going to do. I felt like I could only get that clarity by removing myself from that very deep community I was in the States. Little words that my mom had planted in my mind, it turns out, back when I was about 18 or doing my first degree, you should go on to do a master's. And I was like, well, but why? And then when I was 31 in South Korea, where is my life going? I was like, well, I should just go do a master's, go back to education. I was good at education, and that will help me frame the next steps. And indeed, it did. So I did a master's in international relations in Brussels. And my mentor there said, hey, you've got a real good knack for academic kind of work. You should think about doing a PhD. And I hadn't discovered anything else to do. So I was like, great, I'll think about that. Applied to 3 universities over here in England because I was in that time interested in growing use of Facebook for identity movements. So Facebook was very new. This was only 2007 at the time. It had only been put out for kind of mass consumption for about a year at that time. And there was already kind of indications that groups were starting to be formed. It was a new feature of Facebook at that time. My PhD then at Bristol Uni was about British Muslims' use of Facebook for political organization. And that's what brought me to Bristol. And then it was during the course of the PhD, I decided I definitely don't want to work as an academic. So is the theme emerging? I should say, while I was teaching English and as a foreign language in Asia, I decided I definitely didn't want to be a teacher. So that's again some themes. And while I was on maternity leave because I had my daughter during my PhD, a lovely woman, Fariba, who I believe still works for the Association of Commonwealth Universities, was in my antenatal group, and she worked for HEFKE at the time. And she said, you should come work for us. There are a bunch of recovering academics working at HEFKE. And I was like, great, I need a job. And that really did set me off on my path. So yeah, I did a few other bits and bobs, research associate and teaching, like a lot of PhD students do during their degrees at uni. But really, it was getting stuck into HEFKE. I felt like, wow, now I found my place. Policy work in the kind of sector that really drives me, that I feel like is worth contributing to. And I've not left yet.
And so you were at HEFKE for several years, and then when it disbanded in 2018, you moved to the Office for Students. And across 4 years there, you undertook a series of progressively senior roles. How did you find your time at the Office for Students, and what opportunities did you have there to support the development of the sector?
I think the way you've described it is probably technically accurate, but it didn't feel that way for us there. So it didn't feel like HEFKE was being disbanded as much as it felt like we were being built upon or absorbed into this new entity called the regulator. And of course, as you'd expect, there were huge organizational change processes being implemented. So some people had to leave as a matter of course because jobs were no longer available in the new regulator. There just wasn't a comparator. Some, like me, there was no one else doing my job. I was the head of skills at that time. I'd been at HEFKE for about 6 years. I was overseeing about 8 large-scale competitive funding programs across a whole range of fields, from healthcare and AI conversion courses to graduate outcomes and knowledge exchange. So a real mixed bag. And there was no one else to do that part. And that part wasn't going anywhere because it was funding that we had secured from government through business cases and we're reporting back to government. So that gave me, I think, a little bit of insulation. And I figured, well, let's stay. I had a good team I was leading at that time. I was being asked to pick up some cross directorate work, leadership work, to try to help bring the organization together. And I was really engaged by that opportunity. And that pretty much brought me until the point at which I wanted to go around 2022, which was long enough at the Office for Students for me to get a sense of what the tone and the type of regulator it was becoming. And there was a point at which I could clearly see that it wasn't the type of regulator that I wanted to work for. I couldn't stand by some of the decisions we were taking. And so I respectfully bid adieu to my colleagues and friends there, who many of whom I'm still very close with, and went for some new opportunities.
And that new opportunity was the Director of Strategic Academic Engagement at Birmingham City University. And that was the first time in a number of years you found yourself working within a higher education institution. Was that a conscious decision to make that move to the other side, as it were? And how would you say that time complemented the experience you gained in your earlier roles?
Yeah, it was a conscious move. I was looking to get out of the OFS. I wasn't entirely sure what the next step would be, but going into the sector seemed the most logical opportunity. And I was interested to do it because, other than in the kind of academic, kind of junior academic roles I had held during my PhD, I hadn't worked in professional services, or what I was really looking to do was more at the executive level in universities. So that's what I was aiming for. I do a lot of, or have done certainly kind of over the years, a lot of coaching of other women going for roles. And so I'm happy to say that I did an absolute punter on this one. BCU was looking for an academic registrar. I have never once worked as an academic registrar, but I just put on my boy hat. And I said, well, like they're looking for, I could probably do about 60% of what they're looking for. And the language of the job description was very much positioned for a transformational leader who could deliver real change and impact in the sector. And that had a lot of the skill set in terms of the leadership that I had and could demonstrate. But obviously, I did lack a lot of the real. I'm sorry to offend any academic registrars who are listening to this, thinking, "What a jerk! Why would she think she could do that?" No, I was very upfront actually, and then when I went for my interview, I was like, let's just elephant in the room, of course. But I learn very quickly, and I think actually, if you want this kind of transformation, the skill set you're looking for is actually more in my wheelhouse. They didn't agree on the academic registrar point, and I think that is to their benefit. They ended up hiring a fantastic woman, Hannah, out of Derby at the time, who I had the pleasure of working with for a couple of years. And they came back to me though and said, "Hey, we do agree that we need your skill set, and we've been thinking about this kind of role." And so we started a discussion at that point, and it was definitely one of the highlights of my career. I was engaged with the deputy vice chancellor and the vice chancellor on effectively developing a role for me to come on board to work with them to deliver the change they were seeking to deliver, and that was a hugely exciting time. Um, it was incredibly challenging work for a number of reasons that I could probably get into better over a glass of wine. But it absolutely has been one of the best things that happened to me, because it obviously led to exactly where I am now, which some people will have heard me say I think is the best job I've ever had. So I can only be grateful.
You were at Birmingham City and then you arrive at GuildHE in June 2024. And in under a year that you've been there, you've developed a new strategy, you've got some new members for GuildHE, you've got some new board membership, you have a new organisational brand and website, all within under 12 months. And this is also your first CEO role. How has the last few months been for you? And what type of support have you had in what seems to have been really quite a whirlwind time?
Yeah. Yeah, it has been. It has been. I think my team would like me to answer this question by saying it's been busy with raised eyebrows if they can't see my face. This period of time has been absolutely just invigorating, I think is the fairest way I can say. I came in with big ambitions, lots of drive, lots of energy. That's what the board was looking for. The team was ready for it as well, so they were quite open to the notion of doing things differently. And honestly, I couldn't be driving the kind of improvements that I wanted to, and even the accomplishments that you've just noted, without their support. They really are the engine to this vision I have. The support I have comes from a number of different ways. Yet this is my first chief executive role, and the board, when they hired me, was quite open about that with me, and very aware as they were offering me the job that they would be interested in, providing support as and when I needed it, because that's the sort of thing you need. But actually, the thing about GuildHE that is really fun is it's a small team. There's now 12 to 13 of us, and that size of a team is my magic place. I live in that place. I love it. It's a really manageable one as far as I'm concerned. It gives me the ability to reach out and hold every single team member while also identifying a little bit of kind of hierarchical steps so that I can develop different team members for their, to take their own kind of leadership or management and development steps with other colleagues within the team. So it gives us the kind of bones that we need. And through that little engine, we are like the little engine that could. We are just driving impact exponentially beyond the size of our community. And some of that has resulted in more and more institutions who haven't been members before or wouldn't even typically be considered, typical GuildHE members, reaching out to ask about how they can get more involved with what we're doing. And that for me is the most rewarding validation of the effort we've been putting in. In terms of that support point that you asked, obviously the chair of my board has, I've now gone through two chairs because they were extended. Anthony McLaren, the Vice Chancellor of St. Mary's University, Twickenham, was the first chair, and his term had been extended to give me a bit of continuity to get me settled in. And then he's handed over to Professor Ken Sloan, the VC at Harper Adams University. So Ken and I will be together for a few more years while he's chair, which is great. They're always accessible to me, which is helpful, and that gives me a really good sounding board. But also, I've got a husband who is a chief executive in his own right of a similar sized team, and he's built his business up over the past 15, 16 years. He and I are constantly kind of sharing strategies and asking questions. And I have a really wide network in the sector as well. I've built, and I'm really grateful for, a vast array of colleagues and other senior leaders with whom I can kind of touch base to find out. So although people told me this role is going to be really lonely. Being a chief executive is really lonely. I haven't found that to be the case. And now that I hear myself saying that, I think Randall said the same thing when he was on. And when he said that, I was like, me too, just talking out loud in the car to your voices on my radio. But yeah, I haven't found it to be lonely at all.
You've had the benefit of working for HEFCE, the Office for Students, and within institutions, as we've talked about already. So you are really familiar with the ins and outs of sector life from several different perspectives. To what extent would you say those multiple experiences help the role you have now in advocating for your members and really getting the ear of the regulator, government, and other relevant people or bodies?
Yeah, I would say they're invaluable. I'd say they're invaluable, but also I would say that maybe, I'm always at pains to kind of think of myself as just like everyone else, and then also to try to capture what differentiates me, because I think we're all like that, aren't we? You see what others do well, and you want to emulate it, and that way you want to be the same as them. But then also you want to think, but what's the added value I bring? So, so I say this with a bit of caution, but I do think that my kind of front of house mentality that has been developed through my time in restaurants and vineyards and all sorts of different locations in that part of my life does put me on the front foot when compared to some others, or it might be the added value I might push forward. I think that it it helps me to kind of activate the knowledge that I have. Of course, you need to understand, but I don't ever imagine that I get it. What people are telling me, I don't presume to understand the difficulties they're describing. I want to know more. So I always drive with curiosity too, like tell me a bit more. And if I think I know, then I'll check that. Okay, I've heard that before and it's sometimes been like this. Is that right? And it ends up building quite an iterative relationship with me, no matter who I'm dealing with. And I think that's partly what people respond positively to. I'm not averse to taking on feedback, and I usually ask for it as well. And everybody loves to tell you their opinion about you, don't they? So there's that too.
And one of the notable aspects about GuildHE membership is that it represents many institutions that receive specialist funding because it incorporates those specialist institutions such as creative or performing arts programmes. And without sustaining that extra funding, the diversity of the sector will decrease. And that obviously has a knock-on effect on society, economy, and importantly, opportunities for young people. How do you advocate for sustaining that sort of diversity and that funding when so much of the focus in HE right now seems to be just on basic sustainability?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, Partly, I suppose, because I do have good relationships with those with whom I worked in HEFCE days and OFS days across government, and my team has good established relationships across Whitehall as well. We do have some obvious and open avenues through which to advocate, in the ways that you would expect us to do. But I've been pushing the team to think more about, how can we do it differently? Like if we have done that traditionally and we haven't made the impacts we want, then we have to think outside the box. So we have to do what we do louder. We have to seek new avenues. We have to make noises elsewhere. And it is a delicate balance given what you just captured there, that kind of reality we're all living in now, where so often the headlines at the moment are just about, the funding crisis, financial sustainability, institutions, the redundancies all across the sector. But what is interesting, and I do feel like we have an obligation to point out that the majority of the institutions represented by GuildHE are not, that doesn't represent them. That's not their picture. They aren't at the end of their financial red lines and having to put in place redundancy packages. In fact, as I was just saying to the Education Select Committee team last night, I think, and this is just my opinion, but I feel like perhaps because the funding and regulatory system has been built in the image of the large-scale multi-faculty university, and therefore directed towards supporting that model, most of the institutions we support have already been in a protracted situation of having to make do with scraps. They are also more prone to be working quite closely with industry, so they are naturally more agile. They can turn around programs much more quickly in line with industry demands. They have a number of characteristics within them that make them fast to make decisions to keep themselves buoyant and responsive to their key audiences. They also are very good at filling in gaps. So they operate in a lot of areas in terms of provision or geographical areas that aren't served by our kind of traditional large-scale multi-faculty universities. But I suppose back to your question is that, so I don't see the current conditions as it's not a good time to make that argument. I think it's exactly the time we need to make the argument. You're saying, government, that money is tight, money is so tight, we're not going to give you more of it. You've got to solve your own problems. And I say, great. There's a whole group of institutions over here that have been solving their own problems for years. And now is the time we need to think about how to change the fundamental parameters of the system to preserve the very diversity in terms of institutional type that we know is part of a healthy system. If you don't do it, you'll weaken the system. You'll weaken and jeopardize equality of opportunity. It's not just about making sure it's all fair and everybody gets a little bit of the pie. It's actually about thinking about what type of sector do we want and who do we want to comprise the sector. Do we want a number of wide-ranging, fairly duplicative universities that have become very good at nuancing their differences? And I say this with respect. I don't want to levy any barbs, but I know this is a difficult truth to hold up to ourselves. Or do we want to make sure that we have a range of different institutional sizes, types, geographical areas, provision types offered in order to maximize the value we're driving through society? I think it's the latter.
And to what extent are you hopeful that we can get that message across and that diversity can be sustained?
Well, we are making gains in terms of influencing colleagues in Whitehall to recognize the argument. I've also been counseling my own members against thinking that that will do it. So we are prepared for sustained messaging, and I'm also prepared for what we do to not materialize into the changes we'd wish to see. That doesn't, to me, mean we need to argue less. That means we need to continue to do it as we are, but again, louder, different. We need to constantly be trying different methods until we see the impacts we want to make. I mean, that's the only way to enact change, isn't it?
Advocacy and that outward facing aspect that we've just been talking about is clearly the most visible part of your role to an outsider. But what does your leadership of the organisation look like from the inside?
I guess you could answer that in two ways. Like, what do I do internally focused that people wouldn't see? And what does it feel like? I mean, I would like to talk about what it feels like, but again, I don't think I'm the best judge of that. What it looks like, obviously, is the team and I have been working together to break down what I see as our two core functions. One is what you've just mentioned, the advocacy role, the kind of front facing. Who are we? What are we about? I want everybody to look at us and think that's what they're about. Perfect. Okay. We're not there yet, but that's the aim. And then the other part is what are we doing for our members? So yes, the advocacy is on their behalf, but actually in 2025, there is a huge need to be right into the thick of it with our members, giving them the training that they might need to institute, transformational change, brokering shared services in order to help them cut down expenses if that's what they want to do, commissioning research if that's needed to argue better to government on behalf of their interests, whatever that is. What are we doing? What events are we hosting for them? So we've been developing that in a way that the organization hasn't ever done at the volume and the magnitude that we're pushing now. So internally, it's been a lot about building that sense of who we are and why do we care, while also, working through the kind of ins and outs of a small team culture. They're used to working with a particular chief executive, my predecessor, and they did great work with Gordon before me, and then, shifting them to a different pace with a different level of kind of scrutiny on what we're doing with somebody who is by nature more likely to say, that's not good enough. How could we do it better? Than I am to say that'll do. And that's a shift for them culturally, but they've come to it with like just open hearts and a good embrace. And I also set a tone in my teams of real transparency and authenticity. So I bring my full self to almost every interaction, but in particular to interactions with them and to my board. In fact, I started the board meeting yesterday and we were just having chit chat, telling them all about my anxiety dream about the board meeting. which got them all laughing. But also I said, this is the humanness you need to bring into your interactions because we are all just people. Even as we talk about universities and institutions and our specialist providers that I represent, we're all just people. And I think for me, it's important to see my team as those people, recognize when stuff isn't going well outside of work, acknowledge it and move on so that they can be seen and they can be acknowledged, and then they can also be empowered to focus on work and because what we're trying to do is hard work. It is a bit relentless, but our members, like the rest of the sector, are being relentless themselves. They wake up every day, and we should be in that with them, both in terms of how we're working and with what we're saying to them.
Picking up on that point about things being relentless, I mean, I guess your role as chief executive, it must be hugely demanding, and reflecting on the things that you've achieved during the last nearly 12 months or so. What's your own approach to work-life balance, and how important is achieving that in your leadership position?
It's the most important thing, Susanna, the most important thing. I don't mess around with work-life balance, as anybody who knows me and has worked with me. So I'm American through and through, obviously, and we don't get annual leave as a standard holiday entitlement. Certain financial services and international businesses over there have now started to adopt more progressive approaches. But for the average American worker, and that's certainly how I grew up with my parents, you got 2 weeks off a week. So working in a system where you have 25 as a standard, and even more when you're at my level a bit, it's not an option, is what I tell my team. It's part of your remuneration package. It's to ensure that you are rewarded in a way that isn't just financial, but is also about having your life outside. So if you are like me and you like to travel, then I encourage my team to make those plans a year out. I encourage them to plan it. It's important in a small team in particular that you don't wait last minute, because there'll always be something that will stop you from doing it. If you don't like big trips, I encourage them to take periodic, long weekends, what have you. I mean, there's enough room for everybody to have their own style. I do that myself. I am about 9 sleeps away from going away for 2 weeks. We go away in the summer to the States every year as well for almost a month. Some of that has been enabled by remote working introduced by the pandemic, but we do that. And I think, you have to live to fight another day, is what I often say to my team. And if you don't take time for yourself on the regular, you block out your lunch. Yes, sometimes it gets overridden, but you get away from that computer. That I'm standing on my walking pad, so I'm a devotee now to the standing desk and the walking pad, and I would proselytize to anyone listening to get on it. It has made an enormous difference in terms of my energy levels and just how I feel at the end of the day when I've had 8 hours of being unable to detach from the screen because of meetings or deadlines. And I think that is the reality of the majority of people in our sector. I don't think there's anybody listening to this podcast now who's thinking, that's not me. So, how can you take care of yourself, especially when you are coming into middle age? I'm almost 50. My husband's still kind of arguing, are we actually in middle age or not? But, it's just made a huge difference in how I feel. So there's another kind of way in which you can try and think about taking care of yourself while also taking care of others.
And how many miles are you up to now on your walking pad?
10 and a half, if I'm lucky, 8 at a minimum, Susanna. So yeah, but I should tell everybody, I am quite athletic. Like as a history, I've got quite enough. So, but when I started, I'd been so out of it, and for the first 9 months of this job, I was absolutely just stuck at the desk, sitting, and I was lucky to get a mile walk in a day. That would be what I would get if I take my dog out. And now I'm, 40 is a minimum. So it's hugely beneficial. So listen, everybody, get out there, get your walking pad. You'll finish a huge busy day, and you'll also have achieved, masses of walking.
We talked earlier about the whirlwind first 12 months you've had as CEO of GuildHE. Finishing up our conversation today, what are your goals for the next 12 months, both for the organisation and for you, and maybe your walking pad as well?
Yeah. I think I'm going to maybe top out at 10 miles a day for that. I don't want to overdo it. You get too enthusiastic about these things. And actually that philosophy is probably what the chair of my board is also trying to caution me against. So I have what a couple of us were recently calling persistent impatience or practiced impatience it was. I am always wanting to move faster than others around me might be capable of moving. And there's an important lesson in that about just slowing down in order to ensure you're bringing everybody along with you. So I'll be at a year in June. And at the moment, year 2 looks a lot like continuing to build our offer for our members, continuing to communicate really deeply with them about what it is they need from us and taking on board and being seen to take on board their feedback about how well we're doing at meeting them in this moment. I really want GuildHE to be an organization that isn't just plodding along in the old kind of traditional way of a membership organization, but is seen as a really responsive, agile mechanism through which providers across the country can not only have someone kind of fighting on their side, but can be there to link them to other vital parts of the sector, build their community, help them navigate these waters, because collaboration is going to be, the theme of the day. And I don't mean necessarily in terms of, mergers and the kind of institutional stuff we're talking about when you hear, the latest JISC or KPMG report. That's not what I mean. I mean individual collaboration. I mean working in better and deeper partnership with individuals, because if I can help you and you can help me, we're both going to be better off. And it's a lot about trying to move us culturally as a sector towards that, away from what I think has been a little bit of a kind of zero-sum gaming mentality that undoubtedly was embedded more deeply with the 2017 legislation and the regulatory, vibes at the time. But I think that we have to lead towards the future that we want the sector to inhabit, and GuildHE wants to be a leader in doing so.
Brooke, it's been great talking to you today. Thanks so much for being my guest.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure and an honor to be invited. Thank you so much.
Job Shadowing HE was written and presented by Susanna Marsden, and you can find out more information about her consultancy work at susannamarsden.co.uk. Audio production and music was by me, Rodri Marsden. Find out more about this podcast and hear previous episodes at jobshadowinghe.com.